Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our April Lunch with the League. Today's moderator is the League member, Joni Halpern. Joni has been a lawyer for the poor in San Diego for more than 20 years. She has served low-income families and individuals throughout San Diego County as a staff lawyer for the ACLU, the Legal Aid Society, director of her grassroots nonprofit, and now as a sole practitioner. And she's been a San Diego resident her entire life. She will be moderating our program, and she'll be introducing our panelists today. Thank you, Joni.
In a news conference at the state capitol on March 13th, 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom announced a moratorium on the California death penalty. He vowed to prohibit any further executions of death row inmates in California while he's governor. There is a protocol of death and an administration of death in the state of California, and it consumes the court's time, it consumes the criminal justice system, it exhausts the soul and the pocketbook, Newsom told reporters in a phone call. I would ultimately like to shut down that system of death. The governor's actions have put the death penalty on the front burner of public discussion, and this is why the leadership of the League of Women Voters invited you all here. We wanted you to hear from experts whose clients are clear stakeholders in the outcome of death penalty politics. Alex Landon is a man whose name commands respect in the criminal defense field. He's renowned not only for his excellence as a criminal defense lawyer, but for his tireless advocacy for fairness for those most likely to be marginalized in the criminal justice system: people of color, the mentally ill, the indigent. Unlike many people who start their careers with high ideals only to conclude they're more trouble than they're worth, Alex Landon never gave up on his ideals. He has always conducted himself in law as if every ounce of integrity he invests is worth the effort. He's a remarkable lawyer, a lifelong advocate for justice, and a man who has earned the esteem of all who believe that, however imperfect our progress, equal justice before the law must be our goal. Juliana Humphrey made her criminal defense career in the Office of the Public Defender, serving in management positions and as defense counsel in cases involving serious crimes, including capital offenses. She's a skillful trial lawyer with a keen mind, an iron grip on reality, a commitment to excellence, and a toughness that is tempered by an irrepressible compassion. She was one of the architects of significant prosecutorial changes that made a difference in the lives of low-income women accused of welfare fraud. She has never turned her back on lawyers who work with the poor and need the advice of an expert when the issues of criminal law arise. There is no hemming and hawing. I'll get back to you. I'll call you later. There's only the answer to your question, properly sourced and completely reliable. We are privileged today to have these wonderful advocates share their experience and their views on the death penalty. Please welcome them. We will be kind of using a question and answer protocol here, but I don't want to stumble on the speakers. So the first question we are asking is of Alex Landon. What exactly has Governor Newsom done in issuing this reprieve? And what does it mean to those already on death row and for those who might be facing capital offenses in the future?
So most of you have probably heard what Governor Newsom did. Perhaps you heard generally that he created this moratorium. The question is, what is it? And I thought we'd start by at least putting that into some context. Did he get rid of the death penalty? No. We still have the death penalty in California. Did he actually commute the death sentences of the 737 individuals on death row in our state, the largest death row in the country? No, he didn't do that either. What he did was he granted a reprieve. And our California Constitution actually provides the ability for the governor to grant pardons, grant commutations, and grant reprieves. And he chose to grant a reprieve. So basically what he did was he put the death penalty on hold in California. He granted a reprieve to those people who are on death row so that the state could not execute anybody as long as that reprieve stays in place. That doesn't mean when he leaves office that another governor can't just lift that reprieve and the death machine will start up again. The state of California has had two opportunities in the last 7 years or so to try and do away with the death penalty. We had Proposition 34 in 2012, and we had Proposition 62 in 2016. And both of those narrowly lost, and if they had won, we would not have the death penalty on the books, and we would not have a death row, and Governor Newsom would not have had to do what he did. But he did. And so let me just again indicate that he did it by executive order, and there were three things that he did. Number one, he did provide a reprieve to those individuals who were on death row. So again, during the course of the reprieve, no one will be executed. The second thing he did was he repealed the California lethal injection protocol. So those of you who've been around know that we used to have a gas chamber in California. We did away with the gas chamber. We now use lethal injection. And the whole lethal injection issue has been of concern. The courts have dealt with it. We've actually had a period since 2006 where we haven't had an execution, and one of the things that has been staying the execution of several people is this lethal injection protocol, the fact that the court was not comfortable that our lethal injection protocol was not cruel and unusual punishment. And so they've been trying to figure that out. The Department of Corrections has been submitting different types of protocols, and it hasn't worked. And basically Governor Newsom made that the second part of his executive order, was in effect to do away with the lethal injection protocol, and if we were to have the death penalty to come back again, they would have to create one, and there's a whole procedure that they go through. So if you're not getting the point yet, this is premeditated, willful, deliberate killing of human beings. And the third area is that he closed the execution chamber at San Quentin. So the only place in the state of California where an execution can take place is in San Quentin. San Quentin, as many of you know, is on a beautiful piece of property across from San Francisco. High-value property. They've been trying to close it for a number of years. It is our oldest prison in the state of California, dating back to the 1850s, I believe. And by statute, again, that's the only place where we execute people. San Quentin is a men's prison. We do have women on death row. They're in Chowchilla, and I think there's 21 of them. If they were to come up for execution, they would have to be moved to San Quentin, kept in the death cell, and executed in San Quentin, because again, by law, that's the only place where executions take place. Again, premeditated, willful, deliberate killing of a human being. So he basically, Governor Newsom basically said that he was closing the death chamber. And if you go online, you can see the members of the Department of Corrections actually carrying the chair out of the chamber that used to be used to strap the condemned individual in and to execute them. So that's a third thing that he did by his moratorium, and those were the three things he did. And before I turn it over to Juliana to make some comments, I just want to kind of echo some of the comments he made, Governor Newsom made, in justifying why he did what he did. He's a long-time opponent of capital punishment, and he was honest about that and basically said that he would not allow this to go on while he was governor. But beyond that, he made some comments about things that are well-known facts about the death penalty in California and also around the country. First of all, it is carried out, he said, against people of color, disproportionately against people of color. So, for instance, black population in California is under 12%. 36% of the people on death row are black. And between the Hispanic and black population on death row, a large percentage of certainly a majority of the individuals are people of color. There's another part of that, and that is that individuals who are convicted of killing a white victim are more than 70% more likely to get the death penalty than those people who kill someone of color. So that's another issue that deals with the color issue. Secondly, he said that it's carried out against the mentally ill, and that's another matter that is backed up by facts. In our criminal justice system, there is a disproportionate number of individuals who are seriously mentally ill. Our prisons and jails are filled with individuals who are seriously mentally ill. Our prisons and jails, by the admission of both the prison administrators and the heads of the jails, is that we have made our jails and prisons the place where we now lock up mentally ill people. We've closed down the mental hospitals and we've built up the prisons and jails. So that's where we have those types of individuals, and there's lots of information about that. But it's also true that it's a disproportionate number of individuals who get the death penalty who are seriously mentally ill. The Supreme Court says we can't execute an insane person anymore. The Supreme Court says we can't execute an individual who is mentally disabled. That's what we used to call a mentally retarded individual. And we can't execute minors anymore. So we've done away with those categories, but we still have many individuals who are on death row who are there, who are seriously mentally ill, and Governor Newsom was concerned about that. Thirdly, he was concerned that it's carried out disproportionately against poor people. And those of us who do this work have sometimes said that capital punishment basically means those without the capital get the punishment. So we are in a situation still today where there's a total disproportionate number of individuals who are on death row. We can answer your questions or talk about why this is, but that's, again, a reality that concerned Governor Newsom. He also talked about the cost, and he said in his statement that it has cost us $5 billion to basically run the death penalty from 1978 when it came back on the books, because We, as a country, did away with it in 1972. The United States Supreme Court, in a case called Furman versus Georgia, got rid of it. And then it came back again. So in 78, here in California, we got it, something called the Briggs Initiative. And what's interesting is that both Briggs and his son, who had fought for this to be passed, are now opposed to the death penalty and have advocated both for Proposition 34 and Proposition 62. So that's a huge amount of money that we have spent. And understand that if we were to keep people in prison for the rest of their lives, and that's the alternative here, life in prison without parole, it's still more than 3 times more expensive to do that than to basically execute an individual in the state of California. And that's true across the country as well. And we're spending over $130 million a year in this process. And think of what we could use that for and how we could make our communities more safe using that in a productive way. And that's one of the things that Governor Newsom talked about. And he also said that 1 in 25 people sentenced to death were innocent. And this is from the National Academy of Sciences. And so since 1973, there have been 164 people who have been sentenced to death who have been exonerated. Again, if a person is sentenced to life in prison without parole and you find out that they did not commit the crime, there's a remedy. If you execute them, there is no remedy. So those are the issues that he talked about and why he granted this reprieve. And he felt that supported his action. And that hopefully will get us started in this discussion because, like I said, the death penalty is still on the books. We still have death cases. We still have people on death row. We still have death appeals. The system is still in operation.
Alex will be back with us in a little bit. I just want to clarify something. Maybe I heard it wrong, but were you saying that it's 3 times more expensive? I'm not sure I got that.
3 times more expensive to go through the execution process than to keep an individual in prison for life without parole.
Okay, did everybody hear that? 3 times more expensive to go through the death penalty process than to keep someone in prison for life without parole. Okay, so now we'd like to have Juliana talk to us about what kinds of people are sentenced to death.
It's a cheerful topic following Easter, a death penalty holiday that has a happy ending. What kind of people are sentenced to death? Alex touched on it. It's not rich people. And there's 2 ways to answer this question. One is legally, what's the criteria? And then just substantively, who ends up on death row? And so legally, there are what's called special circumstances in our statutes. And special circumstances are what make a garden variety murder eligible for the death penalty. Okay? We all know murder is bad, that killing someone's bad, and that they get an extreme punishment, even for, put this up here. Can I put this, there we go. How's that? Nice. Want me to start again? Just kidding. So there is already on our books 25 to life for first degree murder. All right, and that means actually 25 to life. There has been some change in that, but I often bemoan the fact that in our newspapers there are people who think that murderers get out after 7 years. It just makes me want to pull my hair out. Okay, so then we want to say, okay, above and beyond that killing, who should be subject to the death penalty. And it's worthwhile to take a step back to the Supreme Court when they reinstituted it, that they thought it should be a rare punishment. It should be something that distinguished what was already an awful crime, for that very small percentage who should be facing the ultimate punishment. And so, unfortunately, in Mr. Briggs' urgency to get this legislation back to California and have our death penalty start up again, in California we have statutorily 22 special circumstances, okay? You might remember a while ago in Illinois when they got rid of their death penalty, one of the suggestions of their commission was that there should never be more than 4 or 5 special circumstances, and they should be very pointed. Multiple murder, or torture, or killing of children, certain things that are just beyond the pale. We do litigation now on the fact that the special circumstances in California do not appropriately narrow the group of persons who are eligible for the death penalty. So far we've been rejected on that argument. But in essence, there are very few murders which could not be charged as a capital case. One of the special circumstances is that the killing occurs during a felony, during a certain felony, and that's often the case, right? A robbery or rape or some other kind of misbehavior, crime. There are, if you have something, for example, financial gain can be interpreted in many ways. Lying in wait is one of the broadest categories. So there are many, many, many special circumstances. Each one has little subparts as well. And so it is very likely that instead of prosecuting only a few for the death penalty and making sure that those are done fairly, that basically we have a world of homicide cases, murder cases, and that most of them, if you're Venn diagramming with me, fit into that. And then what also the Supreme Court rejected was that it should not be as rare as being struck by lightning, right? It should be fair. It should be, once it's charged, I had a judge tell me, so you're saying once it's charged, they should get it more, Juliana? And I said, well, actually, yes, because you should be only charging certain people very rarely. And so if you are charging someone with the death penalty, it should be such a small speck on that spectrum of homicide that may be true, that they would actually get the penalty. But that's not how it works here. A lot of people are eligible, and it is up to the district attorney to decide who to pursue the death penalty against. And that's how it works in California. So you get a wide variety, we'll talk about later, of pursuit of the death penalty county to county. It's very different, very different. And so that is who is literally, legally eligible for the death penalty. But actually, who gets it? Who are my clients who are apt to be pursued? This is what we call mitigation investigation. In a death penalty case, one of the things that costs money is that I must investigate my client's complete life story. In fact, pre-life story now. The ABA guidelines tell me that I need to look at my client's family generations prior to figure out what's going on here. How did we get to that day? And so it will not be surprising to you that before birth, a typical death penalty client may come from a family that's experiencing trauma, domestic violence, or it could be violence caused by drug or alcohol abuse. It could be sexual violence. The mother may be using drugs or alcohol. All kinds of things are going on while my client is in utero. Once he or she is born, mostly he, but I have represented she's, then they're born into that same household. So those things are occurring. School is not a big priority, nor is medical, dental care, any kind of maybe needed mental health treatment. Those things are, just neglected. There's a history and generally found deprivation that is suffered by most people who are charged with the death penalty. We've also looked into environmental factors. People who have grown up swimming in rural areas that are the ditches that are filled with poison, basically, and it affects their brains and their development and their ability to cope with the world around them. You know, I see some faces going, wow, that's kind of an interesting thing to look at in someone's history. But when someone has done something so awful and is facing their very life, we spend a lot of time looking at how we got there. I often pondered during a preparation of this case, wouldn't it have been lovely to spend, I don't know, a fraction of this at the time when we could have addressed some of these issues for this person, for these families. And so it's always interesting, there's always a trade-off. You know, I'm not a believer that there's just one pie. However, there are limits to resources, and what we choose to use them on, I think, reflects a lot about us. So in childhood, my clients have either been victims or witnesses to violence, sexual violence, usually start drug and alcohol use early. They may be mentally ill. They may have suffered a brain injury that went without treatment. Traumatic brain injury, we know, does a lot to the way people think. A lot of traumatic brain injury in our prisons. A lot of it is caused in prison, and then people return to prison because they are still dealing with the sequelae to their previous brain injury. So we have a lot of snowball effect in our world. There's a lot of moving around because someone lives in poverty. They may not be able to stay in the same place. You know, I think about how lucky I was to be raised in the same house from age 6 till, my parents finally followed me down here and moved here. These, sometimes we have to map, and it may be 30 different residences in 5 years for a young child who's trying to go to school, who may have already learning disabilities or ADHD that is going untreated. So you can see how these things mount for that kid. And there's a book out I heard from an author about, it's called Dandelions and Orchids. I don't know if anybody heard that, Terry Gross. It's talking about how resilient, some kids are just more resilient than others. They're the dandelions. They may, because we talk about it, and when I talk to the DAs, they say, well, so-and-so's brother isn't a murderer, and his sister isn't a murderer. They turned out fine, and they're in the same house. And we have to study some people, not just children, but some people are more resilient than others. There are some who require more care. Those would be the orchids in our lives. But, it's even hard for, a dandelion to survive in some of the circumstances that our clients find themselves in. So those are kind of the overview of who finds themselves facing the death penalty. Generally speaking, someone who comes from a background of either privilege or at least food, shelter, and a nominal amount of attachment with their family does not end up facing the death penalty. And I would just say, how am I doing on time? One more thing that, actually two. Alex talked about who the victim is, okay? And I would just add to that, yes, color, gender, age, all those things matter. We find ourselves sometimes when people who are murdered have no family or are homeless, or back in the 80s and 90s who were maybe sex workers. People like that who are killed, they generally do not seek the death penalty against people who kill them, right? If you kill a beautiful blonde child or a person of stature whose family is up in arms and grieving, oftentimes that is where the death penalty is sought, because the district attorney, and I think this is in any county, meets with the victims and takes into account what their wishes are. They don't completely go with it, because I've had families who did not want the death penalty where I found myself in trial, but that is something that is a factor that is considered at the time. And I took one of the questions, Joni, to mean, how do these folks interact in our system? All right? They haven't been functioning very well outside the system. So sometimes it's really hard, and a lot of effort is spent by lawyers to help our clients understand the situation that they're in and to try to help them make good choices now, when pretty much their entire life that has not been a possibility. And so oftentimes they're confused and depressed and just don't really actually know what's going on. And they may have coping skills that they've developed that are very skewed. And so part of our job is to help them through this. And again, those are people who are finding themselves fighting for their lives, who actually don't really appreciate oftentimes what's going on. I know that right now the big thrust in our system is to stop charging mentally ill people with the death penalty, like we do with minors and like we do with people who are developmentally disabled. Right now, the Supreme Court has said we can't kill them once they're on death row if they are incompetent or what have you. But I'd like to see the law go to the front end, and I know the Equal Justice Initiative is working very hard on that to extend those bans to people who actually have a severe mental illness and we know about it before we even start. So that's kind of where, hopefully, I think we're going.
Lawyers to give us their opinion on certain things, so I'll ask here, after practicing criminal law for many years, how do you both feel about the death penalty?
Simple answer, I'm opposed to it. If you haven't figured that out already. Always been opposed to it. But one of the issues that you wanted us to talk about was whether or not it's a deterrent. And I think this is needs to be discussed because you need to understand that we have 20 states in the country that don't have the death penalty, and we have one, hopefully in the next few days, New Hampshire, that won't have it anymore. And if you go to those states that don't have the death penalty and compare them to the states that do have the death penalty, you will find that the homicide rate is higher in those states that have the death penalty than those states that don't. So in other words, no deterrent there. There are various sociologists who have studied this situation, one of them at UCSD here, who actually found that after an execution, the homicide rate went up. So from everything that I have seen and all the studies that I have seen, there is no correlation between executing somebody, having the death penalty on the books, and having a safer society. So I don't believe it's a deterrent. And I wanted to also talk about who we find ourselves with when we talk about the death penalty. So Juliana actually provided you with, I think, some websites and stuff that are on your table that you can look up later. But here's the list of the 10 countries in the world that have the most executions, okay? And think about this. One of them, of course, is the United States. China, number 1. Iran, number 2. Saudi Arabia, number 3. Iraq, number 4. The United States, number 5. Pakistan, number 6. Yemen, number 7. North Korea, number 8. Vietnam, number 9, and Libya, number 10. Think about those countries and then look at the fact that all of the Western democracies do not have the death penalty, and they don't have a very high homicide rate. So that's that. And then in this country, if you compare the states that do have the death penalty versus the ones that don't, again, lower homicide rate in those states that don't have the death penalty. And in California, it's a crapshoot, because although we have the death penalty, there are certain counties where you're more likely to be prosecuted for it than others. And again, if you compare those counties that have sent people to death row against those counties that have basically either sent nobody or sent very few, you will again find that they have a lower homicide rate. So with respect to the issue of deterrence, look at places like Texas, which has executed the most. Look at their homicide rate and compare their homicide rate against some of the states that don't have the death penalty. And look at the death belt, which is the South, where since 1976, 1,220 people have been executed, and compare that to, for instance, the Northeast, where only 4 have. Compare their homicide rate.
Another issue I think on our list was I'm against the death penalty too. Do I think that the death penalty brings closure? That's often something that is discussed in the process of deciding whether to seek the death penalty. I think that oftentimes people, and all these have varying human beings attached to the process. So if you happen to have a detective working on a case that thinks the only thing that matters for you as a victim is to see the person who killed your loved one in the gas chamber or getting injected, then you will be swayed that way by that detective who's talking to you. Conversely, if you have someone who knows what this process takes and what it takes out of you, and that you may be, the resources may be better spent on therapy or money for the family. I was quite struck in New Zealand when their leader immediately said, of course we will pay for the burial costs for these people who were so brutally killed. Of course we will make these families whole when their breadwinner was killed until they can get back on their feet. To me, that is a much more humane response to a tragedy than I want you to live for the next if you're in Los Angeles, 7 years, pinning your hopes on feeling better because someone is sentenced to death. And perhaps it's a philosophical view. Our victims come from all walks of life, as do defendants. And so, but my personal belief is that, and in the research that's been done, there are many groups that have been formed by victims whose loved ones have been murdered, who say, no, I did not feel closure. I will never feel closure, whatever that means. But here's what I did to make myself feel better and to be able to live my life. And so it's not an automatic thing that's helpful. I'm not saying that maybe there could be some people who get a lot of satisfaction out of that. But it's interesting, it's also very split between families of people who are killed. And that causes more rifts between them. One side may want the death penalty sought and go through all that process. And others say, you know what, I'd like to rest. I'd like to spend the rest of my days. And some of the people are, especially older people, I don't want to spend my last 5 years in court. And so that is a needless trauma. And it is very traumatic in court for family members and loved ones to actually find themselves empathizing with the man on trial, or with the lawyers who are serving him. I have actually had pretty good relationships with many family members of people that my clients have killed, because I reach out to them. I'm sure Alex has done the same, because we feel bad. We're human beings. We understand that loss. And we also know better than anyone that there's nothing about court that makes you feel better.
Can I mention one other thing? We were doing some numbers, and I thought it would be interesting for you to know that since we've had the death penalty back in California, of that huge number that are on death row, over 700, we've only executed 13 people in the state of California. There are 2 others that had death sentences that also had death sentences outside of California. So there was one executed in Missouri and one executed in Virginia. But of all those people, and that's where that number goes at what it's cost to keep all of those individuals and to seek the death penalty. Of all those numbers, actually 79 people on death row during this period of time have died of natural causes, and 26 have committed suicide. Of course, if they catch it, they will try and save that individual's life so they can kill them later on. But 26 were successful. And 11 are in the other category that died. So way more than the 13. And if you had life without possibility of parole, which some people don't realize only became part of the law in 1978. So when we got our death penalty back in California, that's when we got life in prison without possibility of parole. Some people don't understand that. Life in prison without possibility of parole means life in prison without possibility of parole. It wasn't on the books before that. So some people say, well, I hear that Sirhan is still getting parole hearings. Well, when Sirhan was convicted and given the death penalty, and then his death penalty was commuted through Furman versus Georgia in 1972, his sentence was life with the possibility of parole and death. Today, that's not the books. That's not on the books. So today, when a person is sentenced, they're sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and that's what it means.
I know this is kind of a bleak question here, but I'll run it by you in case you think you have an answer. You mentioned when we were talking about this presentation, Alex, that the death penalty plays a part in the criminal justice system as a whole. And I wondered if that is too broad a category to comment on, or whether you might want to take that on.
Well, again, the death penalty provides the one situation where when a person is sentenced to death, they have an automatic appeal to the California Supreme Court. All other criminal cases don't work that way. All other criminal cases go up to the Court of Appeal. There's only 7 people on the Supreme Court. They take very few cases every year. And so the death penalty has basically preoccupied their docket. They can't take a lot of other cases. They can't even keep up with the number of new death cases that come their way, the number that they actually turn out. So that's one of the reasons why this process takes so long, but it is an impact on the criminal justice system. It also impacts all of us. Death cases take more time, take more resources, have an emotional impact on all the players, judge, prosecutors, defense attorneys, jurors who have to sit there and make that decision. And by the way, many of them choose or opt for life without possibility of parole. And we know now that if you give the population that option, the majority of people will select life without parole over the death penalty. So there's all kinds of things that impact our system, aside from just the money part of it, that impact our system as a whole. And, basically, I think is a negative or a cancer on our system. And Juliana talked about the victims. Most people, I think, prefer closure. And for a life without possibility of parole case, they'll usually go through the appellate process to the Court of Appeal and run their appellate process in maybe 2 to 3 years. And then it's done. And they don't see the case coming up in the paper again. They're not reminded about the situation. They're not told that, this individual may be coming up for execution, and then it gets put off again.
That's good.
I don't want to cheat the audience out of getting their questions answered, so we'll delve into some of those. This one says, for those who support the death penalty, what do you know as their most frequent argument?
You want to start?
Sure. I think the most frequent argument I hear is that it's deserved, that someone has done something, kind of the eye for an eye argument, that this person has forfeited their time on earth, and that they should be, I've even heard a prosecutor tell me, put down. We put bad dogs down. Why would we put a bad person down? And they're very serious when they say it, and there's no irony there at all. And they don't care how much it costs or what else is going on in our system. And that, I think the other argument is that we take too long to do it, and we should, and there's been obviously a recent statute that passed on that, to try to hurry it up. And so I think, and I think there's a sincere belief that this is just and will provide closure. I don't share that belief, but it's certainly sincerely expressed.
Retribution, that's, you hear that. And of course, the argument, well, if we kill this person, they won't kill again.
Right. That's right.
How do you maintain your own mental stability when you know your clients could face execution?
You want me? Go ahead. I'll think of an answer. Go ahead.
I've tried a lot of murder cases. I've tried death penalty cases. I sleep okay during the murder cases. I don't sleep okay on the death cases.
I think in a public defender office, I have a lot of colleagues and I love them all. It's nice to have a lot of people, like-minded people around you for support. But even in some cases that I've tried, I've had people whisper things to me like, well, I'm rooting for you, Juliana, but not that hard, because they've been very horrific cases. I'm hoping that they are joking. I have one memory of the last case I tried that actually went to trial and fortunately got a life verdict. So I can say that right now, so don't worry. But I really didn't think I'd get that far. I was hoping for a second-degree murder so we wouldn't have to go to the penalty phase, and that's fool's gold, most lawyers would tell me. But I was really crushed by it, and we had a few days in between the guilt phase and the penalty phase where I'm arguing for my client's life. And I know it was unconscious that as I was eating my cornflakes in the morning, one morning, I know I was crying, but not even knowing that I was crying. And my daughter, who was 8 at the time, I feel this little hand on my arm going, Mom, your job's too sad. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. She's an artist. And, it really brought home, like, what I'm bringing home with me, what I can't leave anywhere else. I find as I get older, it's harder to compartmentalize. I think I was much more of a butt kicker in my youth, and now I find that I just care, and my caring gets mixed up with my work. But that was a devastating case, and which, as I said, fortunately worked out. But it is hard. It's hard, and when Alex says it's traumatic for the people involved, that includes me. So it's a selfish thing to want to get rid of it, the death penalty. But it's also really hard. I put a site here that leads you to something called the Capital Jury Project. And when you talk to jurors who have served in capital juries, they never forget it. And it's horrific. Even those who voted for death. It takes a toll. And we have to decide as a society, is that where we want to go with our psychic energy while we're here on the planet or not? You could tell I've become a little bit more philosophical about it, but that's as plain as I can make it, is that do we want to do that to people, anybody? And, the court clerk's crying, the bailiff is, very rigid. It's a very somber and very serious thing that people go through, and the average case takes, a couple months? If it's tried well, it takes a couple months. And you're
More.
going through that day in and day out, all the chemicals in your body rushing to do this job. So it's quite an experience.
Here's an interesting question. Why would a DA pursue the death penalty? What's the benefit?
Want me to start?
One word.
Career advancement.
I was going to say judgeship.
Yeah. Career advancement in the DA's office or a judgeship. Yeah. Unfortunately, that's a reality. It's perceived that you basically, if you get a notch in your belt, that's going to help you to move up the road. And there are some individuals in the office that I think have very strong convictions, but unfortunately that other aspect plays a role in it.
Okay.
We're being recorded.
That's fine.
Here's a question that is worth asking. Are the people on death row being treated and housed differently after the governor's reprieve?
Yeah. I don't know that for a fact, but I am told that basically it's status quo, other than the fact that they pulled that chair out of the chamber. They're still in their individual cells. They are still called condemned. You probably remember the movie or the book, Dead Man Walking in Louisiana. That's what they call people who are on death row when they are out of the cell, dead man walking. And here we call them condemned. And they live in death row. And so as far as I know, there has been no change as far as their housing situation. If we were to get rid of it, then, and their sentences were converted to life without possibility of parole, then they would be put into general population. It would be a whole different situation. But part of the cost is that we are housing these people individually, more guards, more attention, more expensive.
We have some questions here that are kind of a little bit more broad, but I'll try to get them narrower. I guess we would say on this one, do you feel that police are held to different standards in murder cases? And I'm not sure what they mean by different standards here, but do you notice any differences in the accountability of police in murder cases?
I can say from my view, when a homicide occurs, that there's of course a great interest and resources put behind resolving that, solving the mystery if there is one, or making an arrest, or figuring out what happened. And those are pretty specialized detectives who work on those. They know that their work is scrutinized when they write reports, or I think there's been some great advancements in, for example, having statements by the accused recorded, video and audio recorded. That's a great advancement. That a lot of we have body worn cameras now. We have lots of things that help us, kind of get a better picture and a more objective picture about what's going on, so there can be less shenanigans. But I don't think, as far as higher standard, perhaps juries do. They want answers, and so that may be a way. And the same pressures that and rewards that come to prosecutors also address people in the police department. They can make a higher rank if they resolve a case, and if there's a death verdict, because they have to testify and do a lot of extra work. So there's an incentive there, hopefully a good incentive to find the right person who's responsible, but it's also an incentive to seek a certain punishment, which I think personally warps the system. The person who's investigating should not be invested in the punishment.
And in most urban areas, there are homicide teams. So depending on what the case is, Like, for instance, there are sex teams, there are homicide teams, there are fraud teams, so specialized units of law enforcement. So if you call up and you say something has been stolen from my yard or from my car, are you likely to even get an officer to respond? And if you do, maybe a few days later, they'll write a report. If there's a report of a death, then a homicide team is sent out along with their forensic unit, the stuff you see on TV, not so true, but something like that, that goes out and will work the case. And sometimes you'll have multiple homicide teams working on the case. So absolutely more resources, absolutely more involvement, and I agree with Juliana. You know, I think there's a perception that if you're a homicide detective, the next step up is some type of officer status, lieutenant, captain. Yeah.
Here's one for you, and you may want to answer this from the perspective of the larger association you have with criminal defense attorneys throughout the state or the nation. What do you see as the relationship between prosecutorial or police misconduct and the condemnation of innocent persons?
Want me to start?
Sure.
We have here in San Diego something called the California Innocence Project that has been very effective in having certain individuals exonerated for crimes that they didn't commit. And throughout the country, there are other innocence projects. Things like the use of DNA has been used to exonerate certain people. It's interesting in certain places like Texas, where the prosecution has actually fought the defense in when they've asked for DNA testing. Here in California, here in San Diego, we have a unit. All we have to do is call them up from the DA's office and tell them we would like them to check the material for DNA, and they'll do it. So we don't have the same type of situation that some of these other states do have. But the whole area of eyewitness identification is another major area of misidentification and innocent people being misidentified and then sentenced. These are all things that, we've also had a bill here in California now that has changed, hopefully will change the way the police do lineups and handle identification. And there's national organizations and statewide organizations of defense attorneys that are actively involved in both litigating these issues and seeking legislation that hopefully will make some of the changes and hopefully avoid some of the mistakes that have been made in the past. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think that did. Someone wants to know if you see an association between supporters of between gun control laws and the support or not support of the death penalty.
Yes.
Yes. Just
You want to comment?
Okay, so this person is asking kind of a general question here. California is said to be a progressive state. How is it politically that we still have the death penalty? Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah. Well, I think that the problem is that it takes, you get a 15-second or 30-second spot of a grandmother crying about the death of her granddaughter and how the person who murdered her granddaughter is still alive and her granddaughter is dead. That goes pretty quick and it hits you in the gut. That's what they want it to do. And so the impact is immediate. On the other hand, we've been talking about the death penalty now for about an hour, and we've got many more hours that we could speak to you about it. It's not easy to put in a 30-second spot why the death penalty is not the way we should go in California and why we shouldn't have it. I think we're both heartened that the number of people who voted in favor of doing away with the death penalty is about 48% in the last two initiatives, and it was very close. And that's different than it was 10 years ago. We are seeing a difference in opinion. And hopefully, soon, we'll get over the hump. But I think that it's a very emotional issue, and I think that the other side uses scare tactics that impact people, and it's difficult for us to try and calm it down and speak about it. Again, Juliana said this, we're human beings, we have a heart, we care, but there's a right way and a wrong way to do things, and we think that the death penalty is the wrong way.
Yeah, just to also make clear, it requires an amendment to our Constitution.
Yeah.
It's not just a statute. So, we've had a supermajority a couple different times in the last decade, of people who I think would vote to abolish the death penalty, but it can't be done that simply. I agree that, the soundbite kind of electioneering that we have doesn't lend itself to this kind of discussion. It's not easy to say, well, because what you're saying by wanting to abolish the death penalty is not that, wow, that murder wasn't that important, or it wasn't that bad, or you should move on. All right, that's not the message. But that is certainly the message, I think, that supporters of the death penalty feel whenever the discussion comes around to eliminating it. They want that tool in their toolbox, and it's a big hammer. And it drives a lot of other things in the system. And so it's hard for them to let that go. I think they're worried that cases won't settle. If the specter of the death penalty is not out there, why should my client plead to life without parole? And so there's going to be other trials. Of course, those trials are less expensive. And so it would be fine. But there's lots of other moving parts, and the people who are proponents of the death penalty know that as well. And so part of it is, using what I call the misery of others to keep that in place, but it's also, there are other reasons to keep the death penalty that other people want. And so it's really tough to talk against.
Someone wrote here, Oprah said, not what did you do, but instead what happened to you. That particular little dialogue is different than the one we have when we look at the death penalty and even the criminal justice system. Here's my question for you, based on this little card. You seem to care about not just the possibility that innocent people could be condemned, but also you seem to care about the clients who have murdered people and are being condemned to death. My question is, why is it that you are able to ask the question, what happened to you? Why do you care so much about all of these people?
Clarence Darrow, everybody know who Clarence Darrow was? Some people don't. When I tell my class, Clarence Darrow, you'd be surprised how many of them don't know who Clarence Darrow was. But anyway, he had a statement, and his statement was, I may hate the crime, but not the criminal. And so we get to know these people, we get to know who they are, we get to know their background, and we see them as people, as human beings, and we get to know perhaps why they did what they did, and we get to understand that. If a person's mentally ill and does something out there, then perhaps we're learning more and more about the mind. We should learn more. We can send people to the moon, but we still haven't spent a lot of time figuring out why people think the way they do and do what they do. But we are learning more things about the mind, and hopefully one day we'll be able to treat some of these illnesses. But the reality is that that's a big issue. And I remember when Robert Harris, who was the first person executed under the new law here in California and came out of San Diego, when his case went before Pete Wilson, another former San Diego politician, and when he was governor, Wilson was being asked to commute the sentence, and a professor and doctor from UCSD who had basically done the research and come out with findings on fetal alcohol abuse syndrome, something that wasn't around when Robert Harris's case went to trial, basically told Wilson that he was the victim of it, but both parents were alcoholics, he was abused, he was let alone, and on and on and on. And Pete Wilson's response was, "I may have compassion for Robert Harris, the boy, but not the man." Denied.
Yeah, my first boss was Judy Clark, who's someone you may have heard about. And one thing that she has said publicly, because she doesn't talk a lot in public, is something that a lot of us say, and that is someone should not be judged by their worst day. That there's a life around that day. There's a before and after that day. And I think I get a lot of, I guess I find my job endlessly fascinating, because just when you think you've seen it all or heard it all, something else happens. And when you think, I guess I get frustrated with the district attorney knows, that our leaders know, and people who are proponents of the death penalty know, that likely without exception, but I'll say 99.9% of the people who are facing death had horrifying experiences before getting there. Horrifying. Things that would make everyone's hair curl, and has certainly made mine gray. Just a fake. And, that they are victims. There's capital V victims stumbling through life. And then they do something very bad, and all that is pushed aside to pursue a goal of death. And I find that unacceptable. That, I may fail, but I will try my best to make sure that story is told. And, and that is, I think, what makes us human, is those stories, makes us want to know what happened. Everyone asks, what happened? Right? And so we want to know, truly. And those who truly want to know, I think a lot of times come back with a life verdict, because enough is enough. We don't, and I used to have a bumper sticker when I was in law school, we don't teach people not to kill by killing them. And I think there's a great move afoot not to mention the names of mass shooters. Blank it out. And as Alex said earlier, when a person is convicted or pleads to life without parole, their name is erased. We don't hear that name anymore. The people who suffered at his hand don't hear that name anymore. We move on, we grow, we embrace people as a society and move on. That's, to me, how we move on, is to deal with the living.
And just one comment, when the United States Supreme Court decided the case that finally did away with the death penalty for minors, at that time, the United States was one of only 3 countries in the world that had the death penalty for minors. And in the opinion, the majority basically said that the mind of a juvenile is not formed, and that we know that what they may do and the way they may act, perhaps they shouldn't be held responsible for. And in the law, we've always known that there's a certain age that we don't even hold people responsible because they can't formulate in their mind the commission of a crime. Well, here the court said that we shouldn't execute people who are under 18 because of that situation. Now, since that time, the scientists have told us that, especially males, don't have perhaps their mind formulated when they're
Not you, Alex.
20, I'm not 23 anymore. 23, maybe 22, 23, something like that. So, where
30.
do you draw the line? And if, we always say the law is not a science, we're an art. We're not exact, we're not mathematical. And so, we can't make those type of judgments if we don't have, certainty in what we're doing. We're learning stuff all the time.
So before we wind this up, maybe we'll just ask you if there's anything that we left out in questions or anything that you'd like to add.
I don't think so. I think that's, go ahead.
Well, the only thing that I would add is that, again, you have material on your table there. Some of you may have heard of Sister Helen Prasian, who wrote the book Dead Man Walking. And she says that 20% of the population is opposed to the death penalty, and 20% of the population is in favor of the death penalty. And she said that 60% in between is who we need to talk to. So I think what you need to do is, if you've been motivated, hopefully, is to read the data that is in the various websites we gave you. And hopefully next time this thing gets on the ballot in California, you'll not only vote in favor of doing away with the death penalty, but also get your friends, neighbors, relatives to understand the issue and get them to actually take a stand and get rid of it in California.
So I'd like to thank our two panelists here. They've done a wonderful job of presenting this issue.